okay, going back to the book, in Myron Dudurick and Lieutenant Rick Rascola. So these are the two guys that came from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cav. And he just talks about them a little bit. I think it's worth mentioning. Rick Rascola and Myron Dudurick. Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, had 2 foreign-born officers whose accents and gung-ho attitudes lent a touch of Foreign Legion flair. The Ukrainian Dudurick and the Englishman Rascola were destined over the next 72 hours to become battlefield legends in the 7th Cav, as much for their style as their fearless leadership under fire. And yeah, it's you can see what these leaders do, and you do get to see it. But here's when Dudurick, remember he touched down and he was told, hey, go set up security, and here we go. Myron Dudurick and his soldiers had not yet been sorely tested, but they soon would be. During that lull, Dudurick made certain that fields of fire and observation were cleared out to beyond 200 yards, that good fighting positions were dug, that machine guns were placed in positions that assured flanking, interlocking fire, that trip flares and anti-intrusion devices were installed as far as 300 yards out, that every man was loaded down with ammunition, and that ammo resupply points were designated, that all radios were checked and double-checked. Then Dudurick worked very carefully with his artillery forward observer registering pre-planned fires across the front. The officer, Lieutenant William Lund, had 4 batteries, 24 howitzers registered and adjusted on call. So that's, you ever wonder what a military leader does? That's what he does right there. Dials everything in. And here he's talking about, so one of Dudurick's platoon leaders was Rick Rascola. And here's what he says about Rick Rascola. Rick Rascola, first platoon leader, was 6 months out of OCS at the infantry school at Fort Benning, but he had arrived there with a wealth of good training already in under his belt. He had served in the British Army in Cyprus and with the colonial police in Rhodesia, and he knew what soldiering was all about. What he did to prepare his position and his men speaks for his professionalism. So here's what Rascola did. Rascola walked the terrain and tried to see it from the enemy's point of view. That's critical. What's the enemy thinking? Scrub brush, elephant grass, ant hills, and some ground cover stretched to the front. The ground was not as flat as it first appeared, but had seams and thick ruts stretching off to the south with a slight incline away from his positions. The hasty prone shelters dug by Charlie Company 1st Battalion had been dug after nightfall under enemy pressure. Rascola moved his men back 50 yards, which not only shortened the sector, but meant the enemy would now have to leave the trees and cross 40 yards of mostly open area to reach Bravo Company foxholes. Rascola recalls, because of our shortened lines, I decreased the number of foxholes. 3-man holes were constructed. The M60 machine guns were set on principal directions of fire from which they could switch to final protective grazing fire, interlocking with each other and with the machine guns on our flanks. Foxholes and parapets were built and detailed. I tested the holes. Some were so deep the occupants could not even see over the parapet. In these cases, firing steps were built back up. 2 hours before dusk, Sergeant E. Eschbach, A27, and Sergeant Thompson organized a booby trap detail. Carefully, they rigged grenades and trip flares far out on the main avenues of approach. Claymore mines would have iced the cake, but somewhere they had been lost. A screw up, but I felt we were ready to tangle with the best of the North Vietnamese. And again, these guys are lucky there's a lull and they have all the time to prepare this and get it all set up. And that's a big difference from what happened when these guys hit the LZ and they didn't have any of this stuff. They didn't have any of the terrain figured out. They didn't have a chance to set any of their personnel up. And these guys are taking advantage of that tactical situation to get up there and make things right. And, you know, both those guys, you can see that's what a leader does. That's what a leader does. They make sure things are right. They make sure you're ready to win. And you can do that, and that applies to every leader in every position in every industry in every team in the world. The leader is stepping up and making sure we are going to be prepared to win. And by the way, this Rick Rascola, and this is a little bit of a side note, he ended up working for Morgan Stanley as the head of security for Morgan Stanley. And they worked at the Twin Towers in New York City. That's where Morgan Stanley was. And he felt like they needed to do drills, like they needed to prepare, and that, like, well, what happened if the towers came under attack? And they ran a bunch of drills. And when September 11th came, they ran those drills and got everyone evacuated. And Rick Rescorla was last seen on the 10th floor going back up into the building to do a final check and make sure that everyone was out. And the tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m. And he saved a lot of lives that day, not only through his actions on the day of, but through his actions in preparing